Good afternoon, and welcome to day 2 of the Eternal Lectures on Human Values, hosted by the Whitney Humanities Center. My name is Kajata Anieka. I've said my name every day this week at an event like this, and I'm the director of the Whitney. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I see many who were here yesterday. Thank you for returning. For those who missed yesterday's lecture, we forgive you. I would like to begin by acknowledging and thanking my colleagues at the Whitney who have worked for the past year to put these events together. Please join me in thanking Diane, Megan, Inessa, Sandra, and Ashley. Yesterday, I gave an extensive overview of Eternal Lectures, after which Professor Sabin did a beautiful introduction to welcome our distinguished lecturer, Professor Rob Nixon. We won't repeat all that today. I will just say a few words on both Eternal and Professor Nixon before turning the podium to him. The Eternal Lectures on Human Values was established by the American scholar, industrialist, and philanthropist Robert Clark Tanner and his wife, Grace Tanner. Robert Tanner was a New Testament scholar and professor at the University of Utah. He also founded a successful jewelry company which provided the resources for the Tanner's philanthropy. The Tanner Lectures are held here at Yale and at a number of other universities in the US, the United Kingdom, and beyond. Appointment as a Tanner lecturer is a recognition of uncommon achievement and outstanding ability in the field of human values. Professor Nixon's uncommon achievements and his abilities are why we are lucky to host him this week. He comes to us from Princeton University, where he is the Thomas A. and Corey C. Barron Family Professor in the Humanities and Environment. Professor Sabin has already commented on the groundbreaking and influential stature of Nixon's slow violence and environmentalism of the poor. A student in the audience also remarked that the book has been assigned to them in 3 different classes. What I want to add is the creative dimension of Professor Nixon's scholarship, be it in slow violence or his ongoing lectures. I am still thinking of the different phrases from yesterday's lecture, including botany of belonging. In his recent book, Criticism and Truth, my colleague Jonathan Kramnick reminds us of the creative dimension of literary criticism, rejecting the artificial separation of critical writing from creative writing. Professor Nixon is a model of that creative critic whose writing exudes pleasure and style, even when he's writing of the most difficult issues, such as the impact of neoliberal extraction and ecologies of war from Afghanistan to Nigeria. This insistence on the right to pleasure as both an outcome of reading criticism and as a right that should be equally shared in the great outdoors, as we heard yesterday, is a defining feature of Professor Nixon's work. But as he showed in the first lecture, outdoor pleasure is unevenly distributed, despite the benefit touted by work in environmental neuroscience. Communities of color in the US and abroad and other minority groups are disproportionately impacted by the problem of access and belonging in nature or outside. In today's lecture, titled Neoliberalism and the Science of Plant Cooperation, our distinguished guest continues his engagement with an interrogation of environmental justice and environmental science. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nixon.
Thank you so much, Kajetan. Whitney is very fortunate to have you at the helm. And thank you to everybody who's made this visit so pleasurable. Last few days, it's been a great delight to be here in New Haven and to meet with so many people with overlapping interests. So today's talk, keep changing the title, The Wood Wide Web, Neoliberalism and the Science of Forest Cooperation. And the epigraph to my talk is from Eula Biss's prescient book on immunity, pre-COVID book. However we choose to think of the social body, we are each other's environment. So a simple question animates my talk today. Why at this particular point in history have millions of readers and viewers become magnetized by the once arcane, obscure science of plant communication? The past decade has given rise to a vast literature that interprets for popular audiences research into forest sentience, forest suffering, and the capacity of plants to commune with one another. One possible explanation for this fascination with forest science is that Earth's forests are disappearing at an alarming rate. We are now losing a Portugal-sized chunk of tropical forest annually. Yet an awareness that forests are metaphorically suffering does not require a belief that forests are literally suffering, that is, have the capacity to feel pain and communicate their distress across ecosystems. How then are we to explain the current popular preoccupation with the suffering talkative forest, which appears in everything from Avatar to Ted Lasso? Could it be that writers, filmmakers, readers, and viewers are turning en masse to the social forest for illumination and consolation? What if the forest seems to offer ways of reimagining the contemporary imbalance between self-interest and cooperative flourishing, an imbalance that afflicts most societies today? For the contemporary science of plant communication reveals hidden networks of what anthropologist Anna Tsing calls collaborative survival. But the question remains, why now? How precisely does the science of the cooperative forest suggest alternative avenues of social order, there at the crossroads where the human and more than human communities meet and mingle? Native scholars, including Kim Tolbear, Kyle Powers-White, Linda Hogan, and Robin Wall Kimmerer, have been pivotal figures in this turn, none more so than Kimmerer, an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi tribe, whose book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of the Plants, has sold over 2 million copies and remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 years. I'll be returning to Kimmerer's insights later. A second key figure in this process is the Canadian ecologist Suzanne Simard. Working in British Columbia, Simard uncovered an intricate fungal network that enables trees to connect with other trees, plants, and fungi. This network allows the parties involved to trade nutrients, genetic materials, and other resources fundamental to survival. Simard's TED Talk, How Trees Talk to Each Other, has been viewed over 5 million times and translated into 32 languages. From the perspective of public science writing, Simard's crucial coinage was the Wood Wide Web, which has since become a meme. The meme of the Wood Wide Web has proved essential for stimulating public interest in forest dynamics, more specifically in the vital work of what scientists call mycorrhizal networks. The filaments that constitute these fungal networks are exquisitely fine. Indeed, hundreds of miles of fungi may lie beneath a single footstep. Yet these networks play a critical role in maintaining the forest's collective health, and by some estimates, these fungal networks link something like 90% of all Earth's trees. The Wood Wide Web's great corridors of being allow robust older trees to steer sugars towards vulnerable saplings. Conversely, dying trees can send their residual resources back into the network to benefit healthy trees, fortifying the latter's chances of survival. The underground webs also help brace trees in a storm and enable them to share water and nutrients. One tree may transmit chemical and electrical signals through the mycorrhizal network to alert adjacent trees of impending threats. Simard's research helped inspire Richard Powers' best-selling novel, which many of you may know, The Overstory, which won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. A pivotal character in Powers' novel, Dr. Pat Westerford, is a forest ecologist Her prescient research in the 1970s demonstrates that insect-attacked maple trees send out biochemical signals to forewarn neighboring trees against impending attacks. She concludes that, quote, I'm quoting from the novel here, the biochemical behavior of individual trees may make sense only when we see them as members of a community, unquote. The male forestry establishment in the novel ridicules her findings and derail her career. But in Powers' novel, decades later, the new science of the communicative forest vindicates Dr. Westerford's research. Professionally revived, she writes a national bestseller about the capacity of trees to defend one another biochemically and to share resources. Simard's findings on the Wood Wide Web also feature prominently in Robert Macfarlane's recent public science bestseller, Underland. Her research helped inspire the smash hit The Hidden Lives of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries from a Secret World, by the German forester Peter Wohlleben. And that book, too, has been translated in 20 languages. We see the imprint of Simard's work in a succession of influential titles. Colin Tudge's The Secret Life of Trees, David Haskell's The Song of Trees, Stories from Nature's Great Connectors, and Eduardo Cohen's How Forests Think, one of the past decade's social science sensations. At a certain point, the tumbling titles start to blur. The Secret Network of Nature, The Secret Life of Plants, What a Plant Knows, Plant Thinking, Brilliant Green, The Surprising History and Science of Plant Intelligence, Plantar Sapiens, The New Science of Plant Intelligence, Thus Spoke the Plant, The Language of Plants, The Language of Trees, Can You Hear the Trees Talking? Okay, that's just a small sample. Okay. Part 1, Neoliberalism and the Allegorical Forest. In 1986, Ronald Reagan famously declared, quote, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help," quote. The following year, Margaret Thatcher famously added, quote, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and there are families, and that's it," unquote. It was against this political backdrop that in the following year, after Thatcher's remark, in 1988, James Hansen, then director of NASA's Goddard Institute, delivered a historic address calling for collective action to avert climate change. Hansen testified in 1988 at US congressional hearings that climate change was 99% unequivocal. The world was indeed warming. We needed to act collaboratively, he said, to reduce emissions. But Hansen's call to humanity to tackle the climate change with collective resolve collided with the political ascendancy of Reagan and Thatcher's neoliberalism, an ideology hostile to the idea of society and of government. Neoliberals promoted a culture of hyper-individualism and hyper-consumption that tended to conflate freedom with atomized consumer choice. Government was vilified as freedom's adversary, and the idea of the public good receded in favor of individual consumer goods. The net result, a clash between a scaled-up climate crisis that demanded urgent collaborative action and a scaled-down commitment to the social collective. In society after society, rulers have embraced a compromised democracy that cultivates exclusion, widening the circles of disenfranchisement. Autocracy and plutocracy start to fuse. People find themselves both globalized and atomized, abandoned to conditions of compound vulnerability. Many of those abandoned crave an alternative to government by the few for the few, an alternative to mega mergers for the wealthy and community fracture for the rest. The successful have effectively seceded, leaving in their wake disguised democracies that are shadows of what democracy should be. One thinks here of Bolsonaro's Brazil, Orban's Hungary, Modi's India, Indonesia, the Philippines, South Africa, Russia, Turkey, the United Kingdom, the United States, and many more, are all countries where, to varying degrees, the divide between democratic and plutocratic rule has become diaphanously thin. Leaders declare war on participatory democracy, slash voter rolls, hack elections, intimidate voters, and stoke moral panics on social media. The powerful harass, imprison, torture, and even murder non-violent protesters, journalists, and classes of humanity deemed expendable. Meanwhile, surveillance capitalism herds people into siloed online communities where they become complicit in their own policing. Long after neoliberalism's Reagan-Thatcher years, we are witnessing the rise of a surveillance capitalism that, by harnessing the powers of algorithms, redefining the meaning of both privacy and community. Today, fearful multitudes abandoned to market efficiencies have swung right and left. Some seek redemption in so-called strongmen. Others pursue a politics that acknowledges government obligations to protect the most vulnerable among us from climate breakdown, pandemics, houselessness, and preventable destitution. In this context, the current fascination with the cooperative forest makes increasing sense, for the forest serves as a loose allegory for a shared survival from which the self cannot be disentangled. If a tension emerged between Hanson's call for collective climate action and the neoliberal hostility to collectives in general, a similar tension has arisen in the domain of environmental time. A climate crisis that demands collaboration for long-term human flourishing is ill-fitted to the accelerated pursuit of immediate wealth by mega-corporations answerable primarily to the quarterly report. The largest of those corporations became more mobile, wealthier, and more powerful than most of the societies they operate in, particularly in the global south. All this has profound implications for environmental justice during the so-called Great Acceleration, as the crisis of environmental futurity has become inextricable from the neoliberal crisis of soaring inequality. After the 2007 to 2008 global financial crash, the appeal to collaborative forest life as allegory took a particularly urgent turn. The crash intensified challenges to neoliberal economic orthodoxy. Even right-wing politicians who had ignored the inequality crisis were forced to grapple with it. The 1% became a meme. How could an economic ideology that branded itself as rational have delivered such dangerously unequal growth? After the crash, billions who felt they had achieved a toehold of security saw their prospects disintegrate. Given neoliberalism's hostility to safety nets, if you slipped, you did not fall, you plummeted. The COVID-19 pandemic reprised that experience of ordinary people discovering that daily life had given way to new levels of vulnerability and structural abandonment. In the years following the financial crash, we've seen a preoccupation with the following question: how do we remedy growth so unequal that it is socially destabilizing and ecologically ruinous? Since the 2008 crash, we have seen heightened efforts to rethink relations between self-interest and shared flourishing. It is surely no coincidence that during this period we have witnessed a public outpouring of writing and films about the collaborative dimension of forest life. For the science of the Wood Wide Web speaks to the widespread yearning for systemic changes that reduce social abandonment and allow more people to achieve a dignity of being. The forest networks that Simard and Kimmerer illuminate can thus be read as a counterweight to what anthropologist Julie Livingston calls the economics of self-devouring growth. Part 3, The Market and the Forest, A Clash of Minds, ? Friedrich Hayek, Austrian economist and foundational figure in neoliberal thought, argued that the mind of the market made competition the principal doctrine for organizing human life. Lawrence Summers, former chief economist of the World Bank, has praised Hayek's idea of the price system as a mind. The idea of the market mind, Summers argues, is, quote, the single most important thing to learn from an economics course today, unquote. For Hayek and his followers, no human mind could approximate the omniscient authority of the market's price system. But from the perspective of the disenfranchised, what happens when the mind of the market makes no rational sense? Where can people find more inclusive, more cooperative ways of being to counter winner-takes-all competition? If Hayek's disciples conflate the entire human value system with market-driven price, in other words, if price becomes synonymous with worth, what place is there for values such as care, compassion, and equity? As psychoanalyst Sally Weintraub observes, neoliberal economics has assailed the ethos and structures of care, thereby undermining our institutional and mental readiness to mitigate global threats from climate breakdown to COVID-19. One notes here that even the scientific discourse about the cooperative forest reflects a concern with cultures of care, as in, for example, the term nurse logs for fallen trees that host tiny saplings, nurturing new life through decay. As Ali Wisniewski describes them, nurse logs are, quote, trees finding a way to help each other out post-mortem, unquote. Some scientific proponents of forest intelligence maintain that the forest has a mind of its own. But as blueprints for being, the market and the forest, both projected as metaphorical megaminds, offer radically divergent pathways. Plant physiologist Stefano Mancuso believes that our brain-fixated assumptions about what constitutes intelligence are biased against the kinds of cognition, learning, and pain perception, as well as communication, that plants exhibit. Biological intelligence, he maintains, is, quote, simply the ability to solve problems, unquote, and such problem solving is typically not conducted in isolation. Now, Mancuso's research suggests that a plant may boast a repertoire or vocabulary of as many as 3,000 chemical signals, vital to its interactive powers. Like Simard, Mancuso argues for a distributed vegetative intelligence, or forest intelligence, i.e. that an interconnected forest possesses a vast networked brain surrogate without a brain. The point here is not to insist that plants are brainier than we thought, but that human intelligence and plant intelligence are essentially incomparable. A forest can be both brainless and super smart. In this way, Mancuso and his allies seek to sidestep the charge of sentimental anthropomorphism. Much Western thought adheres to vertical models of life that elevate Homo sapiens above other species. Meanwhile, plants are exiled to evolution's lower rungs. Plants in this view are dumb, mute, incapable of intelligence, and burdened by a primitive immobility. Plants have failed to develop specialist organs like hearts, brains, livers, kidneys. However, while plants may be incapable of fleeing, they can survive levels of predation that would obliterate a human. Because a tree has no unique, irreplaceable organs, it has more leeway for self-regeneration, sometimes even if insects have consumed 90% of it. By contrast, a human whose brain or heart gets eaten will cease to exist, even if the bulk of that person's body suffers no predation. In their decentralized morphologies, plants, compared to humans, possess a very different, more diffuse evolutionary intelligence. As we have seen, Hayek believed that the omniscient mind of the market drives competition forward. Much of the new writing about forest networks deploys a similar language while pointing in the opposite political direction. Wohlheben, for example, portrays the forest as a superorganism that constitutes a kind of mind. Simard speaks of a collective, quote-unquote, forest wisdom, a distributed intelligence that operates as if the constitutive plants were, quote-unquote, a single organism. Neoliberal economics and cooperative biology thus converge on the same systemic metaphor, but as blueprints for being, the two great allegories of mind, the mind of the market and the mind of the forest, point down very different pathways. Part 4, self-interested altruism and networks of survival. At the heart of Simard's revelatory research stands a paradox, what I call the paradox of self-interested altruism. We should note here that the Wood Wide Web exemplifies that subset of symbiosis called mutualism. So we have symbiosis and then two versions of that, mutualism and parasitism. With parasitism, the benefits are skewed towards one party. With mutualism, both parties gain from their association, the fungi in this case, as well as the trees. Fungi are incapable of photosynthesis, yet need sugars to survive. In the well-lit canopy, trees turn sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugars, some of which filter down and reach the fungi through their networked relationship with the tree's root system. The indigenous scholar Kim Tallbear, an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate tribe, notes the rising, if belated, recognition among non-indigenous scholars that, quote, we are all of us, humans and non-humans, a networked set of social biological relations, unquote. This image of networking keeps recurring. Volherben celebrates how fungal filaments quote-unquote, network an entire forest. Simard speaks of trees benefiting from social networks that enhance their resilience. A BBC article is entitled, How Plants Talk to Each Other Using an Internet of Fungus. And that article portrays the Wood Wide Web as, quote-unquote, an information superhighway. Fungal specialist Paul Sametz dubs the mycorrhizal networks, quote-unquote, Earth's natural internet. And mycologist Merlin Sheldrake notes how network metaphors bridge biology and technology. In all of this, we can recognize an ancillary reason for the contemporary fascination with plant-to-plant communication, namely the simultaneous surging interest in the Wood Wide Web and network theory. As a trope, the Wood Wide Web speaks to our current obsession with clustered communication, social media, crowdsourcing, swarm intelligence, and the hive mind, and so forth. Thus, the Wood Wide Web acquires an extra contemporary resonance. On biological, cultural, and political fronts, we are only beginning to comprehend the intricate dynamics between networked competition, altruistic self-interest, and collective resilience, all enabled by permeable corridors of being. Part 5, Biological Thatcherism and the Porous Self. By the mid-1970s, neoliberal advocates of competitive self-interest had found a new ally. They turned to sociobiology to reinforce their ranks. Eminent sociobiologists were arguing that the self's ruthless drive to compete is hardwired in evolutionary terms and irrefutable. Small wonder that free market fundamentalists started invoking sociobiology in an effort to naturalize an economic model premised on selfishness. This gave unfettered capitalism a genetic rationale. If hypercapitalism is the economic system most compatible with the dictates of our DNA, that weakens the case for any alternative system that may seek to temper the self's acquisitive drive. We can track the powerful tag team of neoliberalism and sociobiology back to the cusp of neoliberalism's ascent within Anglo-American politics, from where it spread to other societies and global institutions. The mid-1970s saw the publication in quick succession of two sociobiology blockbusters, E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology, The New Synthesis in 1975, and Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene in 1976. All these developments helped shape the cultural milieu that contributed to Thatcher's rise to power in 1979 and Reagan's in 1980. The contest of the meaning of freedom became critical in all of this. For Karl Polanyi, a core problem of neoliberalism was that, quote, the freedom that regulation creates is denounced as unfreedom. The justice, liberty, and welfare it offers are decried as a camouflage of slavery, unquote. Back in the mid-1980s, the British feminist philosopher Mary Midgley questioned the reactionary alliance that was emerging between sociobiology and neoliberalism. Midgley found sociobiology's naturalizing of extreme capitalism deeply suspect. She dismissed Dawkins' view on evolution as politically motivated. Quote, the ideology Dawkins is selling is the worship of competition. It is projecting a Thatcherite take on economics onto evolution. It's not an impartial scientific view, it's a political drama, unquote. Indeed, Midgley saw the entire field of sociobiology as corrupted by what she called biological Thatcherism. Midgley questioned selfishness as a catch-all term for the underlying biological and economic principle of life. Quote, selfish is an odd word because its meaning is almost entirely negative. It does not mean prudent, promoting one's own interest. It means not promoting other people's, or, as the dictionary puts it, devoted to or concerned with one's own advantage to the exclusion of regard for others. Just as there would be no word for white, Midgley continues, if everything was white, there could surely be no word for selfish if everyone was just that all the time, unquote. Thus, a tendentious scientific metaphor, the selfish gene, acquired a political logic that helped shape the agendas of global economic institutions. In a rather astonishing turn, Dawkins would later regret that he had not called the selfish gene the cooperative gene. But by then it was too late. His metaphor had bolted from the barn. By then, neoliberalism was twinned to a neo-Darwinism that misconstrued Darwin. Together, this ideological tag team advanced the notion that the atomistic individual has evolved to exist in a state of relentless competition. Yet much of the science of selfhood has been pulling in the opposite direction. Charles Whitman has insisted on our quote-unquote composite individuality. And as early as the 1970s, Lewis Thomas was arguing that, quote, a good case can be made for our non-existence as entities. We are shared, rented, occupied. My cells are ecosystems more complex than Jamaica Bay, unquote. More recently, we've seen similar views voiced by Ed Yong in his bestseller, I Contain Multitudes. The idea that every self is a form of communal living runs counter to the dominant strains of neoliberal thought. Neoliberals have sought to recast Homo sapiens as Homo economicus, arguing that society is reducible to the economy. Yet the Human Microbiome Project has determined that at a cellular level, any given person is only between 1 and 10% distinctively human. In this view, the self is a shape-shifting convocation, a gathering place of life forms, some benign, some hostile. The colon, the body's so-called second brain, depends on a jostling microbial crowd without which it could cease to function. Amid the ever-changing arrangement of microorganisms and fungi that help constitute the self, the individual emerges as incorrigibly plural. In short, it is a biological and ontological error to construe the individual and the collective as polar opposites, for the self is always already symbiotic, social, collectivized. As one researcher puts the matter pithily, your body is not you. Section 6, Troubling the Tree of Life. Scientific metaphors may open new avenues of but they may sometimes also obstruct iconoclastic thought. For figurative language can harden into unexamined doctrine. Like the selfish gene, the tree of life has become a master metaphor that exerts an outsized power. The tree of life promotes a vision of evolutionary history, a vision so commonplace that its figurative roots are difficult to discern. But the idea of a vertical evolutionary tree of life has been challenged by microbiologists like Lynn Margulis in her research into interspecies fusion. Margulis's account of endosymbiosis as a key evolutionary mechanism is particularly pertinent here. So by endosymbiosis, I'm referring to when one living organism lives inside another, the body of another, usually in a condition of mutualism. Margulis's research poses this question: what if the family tree is not nearly as familial as presupposed, including by Margaret Thatcher? The vertical assumptions about evolution inherent in the tree of life belie the genetic complexity of the compound self. Margulis, Tsutomu Watanabe, Carl Wusser, and many others have all argued that evolution happens not only vertically, but also laterally through the movement of genes across species lines, a process called horizontal gene transfer. This radical line of research challenges, in David Quammen's words, quote, the traditional certitude that genes flow only from parents to offspring and can't be traded sideways across species boundaries, unquote. Over time, bacteria may evolve into cellular organs in a host species. This morphing generates profound forms of interspecies fusion. Thus, a compound self has even deeper biological roots than is commonly assumed. If cooperation, that is, if altruistic self-interest, may strengthen biotic resilience, that resilience may also be shaped through interspecies cellular incorporation over great expanses of evolutionary time. Margulis's iconoclastic work on endosymbiosis proved crucial for broadening our understanding of cellular entanglement. What she illuminated was a form of symbiosis whereby complex cells can develop from the fusion of diverse life forms. Captured bacteria may gradually morph into what are called organelles inside the host, thereby helping generate new species. Seen in these terms, the self is not just involved in symbiotic interactions with other selves. Rather, at a cellular level, the self is already the result of amalgamated entities. So the horizontal dimensions to endosymbiosis unsettle the status of the tree of life as an all-encompassing evolutionary trope. Sociobiology and neoliberalism both skew very much towards vertical models. As Arundhati Roy has observed, neoliberals' vertiginous levels of inequality enable, quote, the vertical secession of the rich, unquote. But if the aloof self-standing self is a biological fallacy, we can remove a powerful genetic determinant from neoliberal efforts to root an economic ideology in the towering tree of evolution. Neoliberalism, by downplaying horizontal entanglements and responsibilities, contradicts the basic biology of flourishing. For we all exist in states of conjoined survival that involve, in ways that we're just starting to understand, a complex duet between competition and cooperation. To insist as much is not to deny competition, but rather to temper our understanding of competition with a more complex set of life relations. The forest is not some Shangri-La, some tree-on-tree love fest, tree hugging with the huggers or the trees themselves. What emerges rather is an ecosystem rife with competition, but also replete with this: abundant cooperative gestures from co-creators of regenerative worlds. Conclusion: tangled roots, braided lives. 4.5 decades after the Reagan-Thatcher neoliberal revolution, billions of people feel stretched thin between hyper-individuation and hyper-globalization, disempowered on both fronts. On the one hand, we are caught up in a lonely churn of self-optimization driven by our algorithmic overlords. On the other, we feel overexposed to forces so global they feel impossible to grasp, far less transform. To many, the neoliberal insistence on short-term profit and unregulated, unequal growth feels futureless. It has the ring of an ecological death rattle. Many people yearn for fealty to something larger than the barricaded self, but smaller than the global marketplace. The climate and COVID crises have both intensified a yearning to repair a threadbare social fabric, which is always also environmental. Many hunger for empathy, affinity, connection, alliance, for less creative destruction, more palliative care. To help offset systemic abandonment by a hollowed-out state, many communities have resorted to compensatory networks of mutual aid. And despite the predatory assaults of a globalized neoliberalism, communal property regimes persist as forms of collective understanding, particularly among some indigenous communities. It is in this context we can read the contemporary allure of cooperative biology as well as indigenous knowledge systems. Cooperative biology and many indigenous cosmologies in all their diversity may figure personal and group survival differently from how neoliberalism represents them. For despite many divergences, cooperative biology and indigenous epistemologies frequently underscore the collaborative dimensions to resilience, not least resilience against climate change. Both knowledge systems embrace interdependence as fundamental to the nature and persistence of life itself. In many indigenous communities, that conviction has endured for millennia, predating not only neoliberalism, but also the long arc of colonialism, of which neoliberalism is a late manifestation. We can see the dramatic impress of indigenous cosmologies on some of the new botany of cooperation in, for example, Thus Spoke the Plant by evolutionary ecologist Monica Gagliano. After determining through her scientific research that plants possess subjectivity, volition, consciousness, and bioacoustic powers, Gagliano immerses herself in indigenous traditions that have long acknowledged such powers when most Enlightenment thought dismissed them. We see a kindred spirit at work in anthropologist Eduardo Cohen's How Forests Think, where he grapples with the forest's non-verbal communicative powers. Cohen turns to the indigenous animism of Ecuador's Runa people as a way of entering the spirit life that animates what Cohen calls the thinking forest. For Cohen, that Amazonian world of being, interdependent and richly communicative, offers a hopeful counter to a Western emphasis on the bounded self, which he construes as exacerbating ecological destruction. Simard, too, acknowledges a debt to indigenous understandings of the forest's cooperative dimension. Quote, "I'm standing on the shoulders of thousands of years of knowledge. I think it's important that we all recognize this. I have come full circle to encounter these indigenous ideals with their long-standing recognition that everything is connected," unquote. The work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I mentioned at the outset, assumes a special pertinence here. Much of Kimmerer's thinking arises from a place where indigenous lifeways and evolutionary pathways converge. Her double perspective as an indigenous elder and a professional botanist helps bridge ecological science and elder knowledge. Botanical research on the one hand, and spirited matter. This affords Kimmerer complementary prisms through which to view the lively social forest. We see this, for instance, in her considerations of how trees converse to synchronize their actions during masting. Every few years, a tree species, pecans for example, collectively generate a great outpouring of nuts, a synchronized abundance so vast that it often crosses state and national boundaries. Mastering on that scale requires advanced communication, vindicating, in Kimmerer's view, the elders' insistence, long ridiculed by science, that trees talk. And so the idea of the mastering is that by creating a superabundance of nuts or acorns, survival is the chances of survival are increased because the predators are overwhelmed by the amount of food available. Kimmerer's explanation of mastering shares some common ground with Simard's account of the Wood Wide Web. Extensive subterranean networks, fungal bridges as they are called, connect one tree with another, thereby communicating from tree to tree the impulse to mast in concert. Assisted by these fungal bridges, the carbon surplus finds expression in a collective cascade of nuts that Kimmerer likens to the actions of Robin Hood. Quote, "They take from the rich and give to the poor, so that all the trees arrive at the same carbon surplus at the same time. Through unity, survival, all flourishing is mutual," unquote. By invoking Robin Hood, Kimmerer suggests a larger commitment to a redistributive politics, to an insistence that the survival of the fittest is a scientifically skewed figure of speech. Kimmerer, Simard, and Mancuso, as well as others, offer an alternative set of linked metaphors: the Wood Wide Web, the fungal bridge, the mycorrhizal network, all dramatizing interconnectedness rather than centering agency in a bounded sovereign self. The work of Kimmerer and kindred indigenous thinkers refuses a damaging species exceptionalism. That refusal runs deep in most indigenous cultures and long predates the failures and inequities of the neoliberal age. Settler colonial societies have repeatedly sought to impose on indigenous life a hierarchical worldview in which Cartesian dualism and utilitarian economics prevail. Neoliberalism carries forward crucial aspects of such colonial thinking, whereby human ingenuity is assumed to grant nature meaning by imbuing hitherto dumb matter with economic value. In these terms, inert nature only accrues value when humans convert raw materials into commodities. Those commodities acquire market vitality and worth by entering the dynamics of the marketplace. But trees are more than timber in waiting. They are lively actors shaping Earth's life systems. Trees exemplify Margulis's insistence that, quote, "life is matter that chooses," unquote. Trees are, moreover, for Kimmerer, our evolutionary seniors and potential guides. Her perspective encourages us to rethink evolutionary wisdom so as to allow for certain suggestive, though always partial, alignments with the findings of Simard and other scientists. Mancuso, for instance, depicts humans as, quote, "existing on a continuum with the acacia, the radish, and the bacterium. Intelligence," he says, "is a property of life," unquote. Significant differences, of course, exist between indigenous and non-native perspectives. Such differences also exist from one scholar and one First Nation to the next. But indigenous epistemologies and the botany of cooperation do share some affinities, including this. They spurn the notion of Homo sapiens as standing above ecosystems in a posture of earth mastery that vindicates earth plunder. Kimmerer, Torbe, Simard, Mancuso all reject a supremacist, separatist ideology of biotic hubris. These affinities, however partial, remain vital, for it is out of such alignments that coalitions for deep change arise. The interactive forest suggests an alternative path forward to that promoted by neoliberal politicians and think tanks. The forest reconceived this way offers a scientifically informed allegory of a more just society in which redistribution favors communal survival and in which long-term collective resilience depends on tempering short-term gain. This ascendant understanding of forest dynamics provides a counter-narrative of flourishing, a model of what George Monbiot has called, in another context, quote, private sufficiency and public luxury, unquote. The stakes in all of this are huge, for as environmental writer Kennedy Warren observes, quote, it is precisely by challenging the philosophical boundary between a sentient humanity and an insentient earth that ecological repair becomes possible, unquote. Undertaking such repair demands that we reimagine the boundaries of being with a fluid, scientifically informed generosity. That is, with a generosity that has long been evident in many indigenous cosmologies, but that neither neoliberal economists nor biological Thatcherites can entertain. Small wonder, then, that the science of self-interested altruism has become a source of public fascination in our times. Small wonder that defenders of the greater public good should be drawn to the science of resilience through sharing. And small wonder that as neoliberalism rips through the social fabric and the web of life, environmental defenders are reaching out to build vital coalitions of repair that include the sentient forest itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Nixon, for that insightful and very generative lecture. We have some time for questions, picking up from yesterday, if possible.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's a really illuminating set of insights. I wanted to ask you a straightforward question based on Philippe de Scola's work on the nature-culture divide, where he sets forth a number of figures of dimensions of engaging human engagement with reality. If you're able to draw a bit, you present to us several figures. I'm making a comparison there. I'm wondering about de Scola's work, if you can have multiple figures working simultaneously. So I'm asking you the question also about multiple modes of this market-driven, forest-driven, the way you described it. You see multiple possibilities of configuring these figures.
Sorry, by figures, do you mean the figures of speech?
I mean the figures of a forest,
okay.
And the figures of market-driven.
Yes, yeah, right. Yeah, so I think both of those exist on a spectrum. So you have variations, you know, extremes, one kind or another. But so, you know, it's what I was drawn to was and where my thinking started was when I started seeing the mind of the forest and the mind of the market. And I was thinking, okay, what is the evolution, as it were, of those two tropes, and why have they become so powerful? I mean, particularly the mind of the market. And the idea of the mind of the forest was both redistributive, but also taking the social into the ecological. And I think that's part of the attraction of it, is not separating out society from resources. And so that, I'm not sure if I'm getting to what you're asking, but I think that there's a kind of a spectrum of positions on both fronts. But we have been living so long with versions of neoliberalism that there's a risk that becomes naturalized. And so, you know, drawing on theorists like Anne McClintock's work on the use of nature as an authority to try to justify, vindicate social systems. I mean, there's the use of nature and the use of the family of man and so forth, to try to create a deeper evolutionary rationale for a circumstantial economic system. And so I think part of my thinking behind this project was that neoliberalism, through all its mutations, been around quite a long time. And so the way in which the science that used to reinforce neoliberalism seemed to naturalize it, now there's this other branch of forest science that is questioning it or undermining it or presenting other life systems that can provide a sort of an allegorical alternative for human systems that seem so badly out of joint. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Fantastic talk. I just wanted to add or draw out this mind of forests and also the attraction for people. Because we've been having webinars here with the Forest School, Orion Magazine, the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, and with many of the people you've mentioned, Hidden Life of Trees and Robin and Rob McFarlane and so on. And 4,500 people have signed up for these webinars, which suggests, certainly supports what you're talking about. But I just want to invite into our thinking this clearly the sense that the world is dead, that matter doesn't matter, and that disconnect that's so profound in our moment. So I just want to draw you out on this notion of differentiated sentience, that the forests are alive, but animal behavior is giving us this in communication, in migrations, and so on. So it's kind of exploding, isn't it? Yeah. And so that sense of the need for the deep connection that is coming both from science and from nature writers, I think is electrifying for people, for that sense of belonging and relationality and interdependence.
Absolutely. And I think it's the pull away from cerebrocentrism, if that's a word, I think it is a word, of a brain-centric idea of intelligence is manifest in the contemporary interest in other fronts as well. I mean, if you think of the interest in octopuses, for instance, you know, My Octopus Teacher, Cy Montgomery, there are a whole series of best-selling books on octopus intelligence as well. And part of it is that I think something like between 25 and 50% of the neurons in the octopus are in the tentacles. And so it doesn't have a centralized intelligence. The tentacles have a high degree of sovereignty. And so again, you have a kind of a centrifugal model of intelligence. Also, if we think of the concern around the bleaching of coral reefs, and that being related to, I think, by many people sort of allegorically as well, as oceans warm and acidify, the symbiotic interdependence of the algae and the coral gets ruptured. The coral evicts the algae, and the algae is responsible for photosynthesis, and thereby, by feeding the coral, it liberates the coral to create more coral. But under these extreme stress situations, the coral basically evicts, the host evicts the thing. So you have a breakdown in the symbiosis. So that also has a kind of, it's there in the science, but it also has a pathos that, for instance, in children's writing, you know, it's possible to communicate that with a certain message about interdependence. Yeah.
We're grappling some at the Center for Environmental Justice on how to mainstream Indigenous knowledge, to put it super bluntly. So when you think of the market mind and you think of the term invisible hand, right? Nobody would say you could ever rationally be sure of everything that the market was going to do. Yeah. You also cannot ever be rationally sure of whatever the forest is going to do, the forest mind is going to do. And yet, if we were to try to put Indigenous knowledge in a more mainstream position, but proof is a huge question and barrier, right? Like, well, sure. But there's knowledge that doesn't follow the same kinds of proof. And we seem to accept that in the market mind, maybe because we don't have proof of why it works all the time. Mm-hmm. So just that question. I think we struggle when thinking about how to mainstream indigenous knowledge, how to leapfrog or avoid or get out of that question of proof and science or whatever. Even though you've done a wonderful job of integrating its value to your talk.
So to come back to the theme of thanks for that question, of the 10 lectures, the humanities. I mean, one doesn't want to overstate what humanities and the arts can do, but having been for some decades in environmental programs that are predominantly populated by scientists and engineers, I'm constantly thinking about this relationship. And I keep coming back to a comment that James Baldwin made, which is that the role of the artist is to discover the questions behind the answers. And many of these proof style, the question answer refrain of the scientific proof conceals or camouflages the questions, which was partly what I was trying to talk about yesterday in the neuroscience, is what questions are not being asked about the healthy benefits of spending time in nature. So that's one way of coming at it. The other way is to acknowledge that in so many areas of life, there is such a thing as non-data driven knowledge. Now, obviously, at the university, at universities in general, there is frequently a conflation of data and knowledge. And that's, to me, an untenable conflation, even though it produces better grants. That, if I were to say, did Rachel Carson have an impact on the environmental movement? Most people would probably say yes, and will say, well, how do we know that? So when JFK appeared on stage, he referred to her work. Her book sold 20 million copies, was translated into 43 languages. When there was a documentary a couple of years after Silent Spring came out, at that stage there were only three TV channels in America, and something like 20% of the population not only watched the documentary about Silent Spring, but watched it simultaneously, because that's the only way you could do it. So there is a sense of enormous impact. But how do we quantify that? People bought the book but not read it, bought the book and stopped at the chemical equations, bought the book, read it and been unaffected, or bought the book and read it and decided to change the world. Okay, and then we have to say, well, what was Carson's relationship to things like the Santa Barbara oil spill, the multiple self-combustions of the Cuyahoga River, 1970 Earth Day? You had this wave of environmental legislation during the late 60s and particularly early 70s, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and so forth. So all of these fed into the environmental movement, and I would challenge anybody to say that Carson didn't have an influence, but I think it's completely futile to try to map that systemically and convert it into data, persuasive data. The other thing I would say about that also is that there is now a much greater recognition of the environmentalism of the poor, and the degree to which environmental knowledge developed in relationship to particular ecosystems where people lived, whether we're talking about indigenous communities or people who have been marginalized by colonialism. They have bodies of knowledge, and part of the turn in environmental studies at the moment, I think, is a deeper acknowledgement of that and an acknowledgement of the epistemic violence that was entailed in sort of centering a sort of white middle class, wilderness-centric, often anti-human environmentalism. So yeah, those would be my thoughts.
So your kind of starting question in terms of why is this like wood wide web, this idea of plant communication so popular or so alluring in the context of neoliberalism? One of the questions that was kind of percolating in the back of my head the entire time would be in terms of these two things that you're thinking about in relationship to one another. Where would you place like the aesthetic allure of plant communications, or of like, I have a friend who works on this, so like I talk to her about it a lot, about the fact that like if you go into any kind of like kitschy, like earthy, crunchy, or also just kind of like aesthetic looking store, like you've got a whole table of mushroom books on it. Yeah. Some of them are some of the ones that you named. Others are kind of mushroom books that are like made to be coffee table books, etc. And so there's a certain type of aesthetics attached to that is very much trading on, I mean, a certain type of like nature imagery, but also like trying to kind of visualize the connectivity that is, as I hear you talking about, like the thing that is alluring about it. But I also take it that it's an aesthetics that itself is kind of bearing with it, both like this sense of, not only a sense of sort of like the sexiness of it, but also that like itself is like the aesthetics of it is attached to a sense that it's something that is not only more accurate in a way that you're, or potentially more accurate, like more scientifically, whatever, but also somehow more ethical because it is reflective of ecological realities. But then at the same time, I'm wondering, like, can that aesthetics itself be drawn back into the logics of neoliberalism? So where would you place this question of like the allure of this plant communication thing in terms of its aesthetic allure?
Yeah. So we all have kind of personal tipping points as to where something becomes alluring and cringeworthy. So it's on a spectrum, and I respect however people position themselves in relation to that. But Kimmerer has a wonderful essay that I'm sure some of you know called The Grammar of Animacy, where she talks about how in children's literature it's perfectly acceptable to have a tree or a beaver be a he or a she, to talk, to communicate, to have a sophisticated inner life. And then part of child development, certainly in most Western societies, is that the child matures out of that and starts referring to the tree as an it. Okay, so the depersonalizing of what was personalized in a kind of infantile mode. Okay, and so Kimmerer talks about in Potawatomi and some other native languages how there isn't that it, that it. And in addition to that, there's a kind of an animacy to a very verb-driven language, as opposed to a noun and pronoun-driven language, which you see English as. And so there's a way in which I think part of the appeal does relate to an experience through children's film and interacting species. I mean, children are very often open-minded about the chat that the otter has to the oak tree, and vice versa. So I think that there's a time of life when we're open to that, and then we're sort of educated out of that silliness. And what Kimmerer is saying is that silliness contains more truths than a very linear idea of human development might suggest. Yeah, and so I think that's partly where the aesthetic.
We have time for one final question. Yeah.
So I love your formulation about the mind of the market as opposed to the mind of the forest. And I keep imagining what would happen if the mind of the market were sitting in this room. And then my question, perhaps it is, would someone else like to take that? I'm asking myself, what would the mind of the market dislike in your presentation? I find myself imagining the mind of the market, looking perhaps at that image and thinking, wonderful, the cooperators will just keep producing. They will put up the timber, they will put up the labor, they will make humans available, and then we, the marketers, will come in and we will cut them, employ them, take advantage of them, and cut and run. So that's the question. What should the mind of the market not like in your presentation and its implications?
Thank you. Yeah. So I think this question of mutualism, both biologically and then also mutual aid. So the mind of the market is against regulation, it's against trade unions, it's against organized control. And the idea that the individual is not self-sufficient and isolated, but actually networked into support structures. And so the hollowing out of care, that has taken place during these neoliberal decades has affected many people's perception of government itself. So that if you starve the beast, government becomes more and more inefficient, and therefore government itself, the idea of government, is thereby stigmatized. And people can lose sight over time of some of the historic responsibilities of government in certain societies and certain periods. So keeping alive the political versatility across cultures and across periods, I think, is an important part of this, and can be connected to challenging these assumptions that, in evolutionary terms, we're selfish. That's just the way it is. It's in our DNA, So I think there are these different fronts that we can approach the problem from, and say, no, there are many, many different forms of socio-environmental organization. And what do these different systems indicate about possibility and a more inclusive idea of social well-being? Yeah.
That's all we have time for in the 2024 Turner Lectures on Human Values. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Mr. Nixon.